Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a prophecy, old as the rust on traitor armor, older than half the grudges carried by the men who would one day try to fulfill it. It goes like this: 13 times shall the traitor king go forth. In the end times the iron fortress shall be cast down, its walls breached and its gate forced open. Those that dwell beyond shall spill through it. The air shall burn and the ground shall melt. The demon shall lie down with the machine. Brother shall slay brother with fire and sword, and the sky wound shall pour its malice forth. The eye shall stare unblinking at its prize, and the traitor king shall cross the bridge of stars. He shall return to finish the warmonger's red work. Upon holy soil shall the fate of man be decided. Sit with that for a moment, because those words aren't just poetry. They are a roadmap, a blueprint 10,000 years in the making, written in the blood of uncountable worlds, paid for in the suffering of billions of human beings who never had any say in what was being built around them, executed by a single mind, with a patience so absolute it borders on something the word inhuman barely touches. And given what that mind belongs to, given who he is and what he carries inside him, and what he has refused to become, despite every pressure the chaos gods can bring to bear, perhaps inhuman is exactly the right word. This is the story of the 13th Black Crusade, the largest mobilization of forces the galaxy had seen since the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart 10,000 years before. The event that shattered the mightiest fortress world in the Imperium of man, us cracked the galaxy in half like a dry bone subjected to stress it was never supposed to survive, and dragged 10,000 years of the long war to a new and terrible turning point. This is the story of the fall of Cadia, of the opening of the Great Rift, of a world that died so that a chain of events could begin that is still playing out right now in the current age of the 41st and 42nd millenniums. But here is the thing about this story that most people miss when they start talking about it. They begin at the moment Abaddon's fleet emerges from the Eye of Terror, guns blazing across the void, and they talk about the siege and the battles and the desperate heroism of the Cadian defenders, and all of that is real, and all of that deserves to be told with the full weight it carries. But the true beginning of this story is not a fleet emerging from a warp storm in 999.M41. The true beginning of this story is a grief so profound it curdled into something monstrous. It is a man watching his father die, carrying the body from the wreckage of a war he helped start, and spending the next 10,000 years making sure that loss meant something. That man is Ezekiel Abaddon. And before we can understand what happened in the final years of the 41st millennium, before we can truly feel the weight of what Cadia's fall meant and why it happened the way it did, we need to understand him, not as the villain in the story, not as a cartoon warlord with an impressive trophy collection of apparently failed crusades, but as the culmination of something ancient and deliberate and, in its own terrible way, coherent. The Imperium of man, at the close of the 41st millennium, is not a healthy civilization. It never really was, not even at its height. It is a machine built from faith and fear and the bones of billions, lurching forward through history on the momentum of its own inertia, too vast to truly coordinate, too fractured to respond with any speed to the crises that constantly demand speed, too proud and too rigid to admit how close to the edge it always lives. Worlds are lost every day in the 41st millennium, and the people who live on the surviving worlds mostly never hear about it. Whole sectors go dark and are simply not heard from again. The enemies of humanity press in from every direction simultaneously. From beyond the stars, from within the warp, from the dark spaces beneath the soil of inhabited planets, and from the dark places that exist within human hearts, wherever desperation and ambition and fear share living quarters. And yet, for 10,000 years, one thing had always held. Not the emperor, rotting quietly on his golden throne in the heart of the imperial palace on Terra, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psykers whose gifts are burned away to keep the divine machinery running, connected to his people through a blazing beacon of psychic light that guides ships through the nightmare realm of warp space. Not the Adeptus Astartes, the superhuman space marine warriors in ceramite power armor who answered threats that would have dissolved ordinary soldiers before they even made contact. Not even the monumental bureaucracy of the Administratum, as grinding endlessly through the paperwork of running a million worlds with the quiet, implacable certainty of an institution that has outlasted every crisis it has encountered simply by being too large to kill. What held, more than anything else, was the Cadian Gate. That place, that bottleneck in the geography of the galaxy, that scar of stable space between the screaming psychic madness of the Eye of Terror and the rest of the Imperium. For 10,000 years, it was the lock on the cage, and whatever lived inside the cage, whatever ancient evil paced those demon-haunted worlds within the eye, plotting and gathering strength and whispering promises of power to the desperate and the ambitious and the broken. It could not get out in any coordinated, overwhelming force without going through that gate, without going through Cadia first. People in the 41st millennium who had never seen Cadia, who might never leave their home system in their entire lives, knew what the name meant. It carried emotional weight that most planetary names never acquire. Terra was the heart, the holy seat, the throne of the god emperor. Cadia was the fist, the wall, the declaration carved in fortified stone and the blood of 10,000 years of warfare that said, "Here and no further." Children across the Imperium grew up knowing, in the way that you know things that are simply part of the furniture of the world you inhabit, that as long as Cadia stood, the worst of what lurked in the eye couldn't pour through and consume everything they had ever known. In the final years of the 41st millennium, that comfort was about to be stripped away. Not because Cadia's defenders failed in any conventional sense, not because they ran or broke under pressure or turned traitor to the emperor they had served for generations, because the enemy who came for them in that last campaign had spent 10,000 years preparing for this exact moment, because the enemy had been patient beyond human comprehension, because the enemy had a plan that the Imperium had not been able to see coming, because no single institution within it had a memory long enough to watch the whole plan unfold. The weight of that plan, and the story of how it finally fell, is what you're here for tonight. So let's settle in, find somewhere comfortable, and let's tell this the way it deserves to be told. From the very beginning, from the man whose grief and fury and terrible patience set all of this in motion. As Section 2, from Ezekiel to the Despoiler, the making of a War Master. Before there was Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, Master of the Black Legion, commander of the most successful military campaign against the Imperium since the Horus Heresy, there was Ezekiel Abaddon. And Ezekiel Abaddon was, at the very beginning of the story, not so different from any other soldier shaped entirely by violence and expectation and the specific kind of psychology that comes from growing up somewhere that has no room for anything other than strength. He came from Chthoniya, a world so close to Terra that it orbited the same star, a place of gang fiefdoms and brutal hierarchy, where the social ladder had exactly two rungs, dominant or dominated, and where dominated had a way of becoming permanent very quickly if you weren't careful or strong or lucky enough. His father was one of Chthoniya's great warlords, a towering figure of local power who expected his son to complete a coming-of-age ritual that involved executing the people closest to him, the friends and companions who had stood beside him, sacrificed as proof of loyalty to the hierarchy and demonstration that personal attachment was something the powerful did not permit themselves. Ezekiel Abaddon refused. Instead, he killed his father. Then he lived in exile among the lower gangs of Chthoniya, built a legend through sheer physical ferocity and the kind of tactical instinct that either gets you killed very young or marks you as someone exceptional. and was eventually identified by the Emperor's recruiting processes for the Space Marine program and inducted into the 16th Legion. The Lunar Wolves, they were called then, before the Emperor renamed them in his son's honor. Among the Lunar Wolves, Abaddon rose the way that genuine force of will always rises when given the space to do so, quickly, visibly, and leaving a trail behind it that made very clear how the progress had been achieved. By the time the Great Crusade was in full swing, Abaddon held the rank of First Captain. He commanded the Justarin, the elite first company of Space Marine Terminators, black armored warriors, whose reputation made hardened veterans go quiet at the mention of them. He sat on the Mournival, the four-warrior advisory council to the Primarch Horus Lupercal, yea, the voice of experienced warriors closest to the most powerful figure in the most powerful military force the Imperium had assembled. The center of Abaddon's universe, the thing around which his loyalty orbited with a completeness that left no room for competing allegiances, was Horus. This fact is the most important thing about Abaddon that you need to carry through the rest of this story, because what comes later only makes sense against it. Horus was not merely a commanding officer to him. Horus was not merely a Primarch, one of those demigod-level beings created from the Emperor's own genetic material. To Abaddon, a man who had killed his father rather than submit to him, a man who had never before found anything worth giving his loyalty to without reservation, Horus was the closest thing to family that hadn't betrayed him first. But he gave himself to that relationship with everything he had. When Horus was corrupted on Davin, when the whispers of the Chaos Gods worked their way into the wounded Primarch through the manipulations of the Word-Bearers and the Serpent Lodge, Abaddon followed. He was one of the first of Horus's inner circle to commit to the path that would become the heresy. Not because he was naive, not because he didn't understand what was happening to his gene father. He followed because Horus was his, and whatever Horus became in the darkness of his corruption, Abaddon went with him. He fought at Istvan III, where the Horus heresy announced itself to the galaxy in a massacre. Loyal Astartes within the Legion's own ranks, butchered by their brothers as the traitors, purged any possible dissent before the true war began. He fought at Istvan V, or that brutal ambush where 3 more loyalist legions were broken in a single devastating engagement. He fought at Molech, where the War Master made his bargain with the Chaos Gods for the power to break the Emperor's defenses. He fought at Yarant. He fought through the long, grinding campaigns that consumed the galaxy in the years of the heresy. He stood at the very gates of the Imperial Palace on Terra, leading Justarin Terminators through the defenses of the most fortified installation in human history, the kind of assault that would have seemed impossible before the Horus heresy demonstrated what 10,000 Space Marines dedicated to a single purpose could accomplish. And then, at the moment when victory should have arrived, when Horus should have descended to the surface of Terra and crushed what remained of the Emperor's resistance, when the galaxy should have cracked open and been remade in Chaos's image, Horus died. The Emperor killed him, spending himself nearly to the point of his own destruction, reduced in that final confrontation to something that had to be interred on the Golden Throne to survive at all. The Master of Mankind expended the last reserves of his coherent psychic power and unmade the War Master, destroyed him so completely that not even the Chaos Gods, who had invested so much in Horus's corruption, could reconstruct anything worth salvaging. There was nothing left to fight over. The center of everything Abaddon had served for a decade of bloody warfare was simply gone. What Abaddon felt in that moment is recorded nowhere reliably, but the actions that followed speak clearly enough. He led the desperate last counterattack to recover Horus's body from the deteriorating battle. He fought through the chaos of an army discovering its purpose had died, past the confusion of loyalist forces, past the disintegrating morale of a traitor coalition that needed its war master to function, and he retrieved the corpse. Then he led the retreat. All of the traitor legions fled, hounded by Imperial vengeance, driven by the furious counter-assault of Rogel Dawn and Sigismund and the surviving loyalist Astartes, into the maelstrom of the Eye of Terror. The years that followed, inside the Eye, were a catastrophe of a different kind. The traitor legions, denied their unifying purpose by Horus's death, once turned on each other with the enthusiasm that chaos always eventually brings to coalition partners who no longer have a shared external enemy. The sons of Horus, Abaddon's legion, fell particularly hard. Their identity had been constructed around the worship of their Primarch, and with Horus unmade, they were adrift. The Emperor's children seized Horus's body and had Fabius Bile create clones of the Primarch, trying to manufacture a new center around which to rebuild. The sons of Horus watched this happen to the corpse of the being they had served, and felt something that has no clean name in any language. Abaddon disappeared. He left the Legion, left the Eye, wandered into a period that historians struggle to chart with any reliability. He went through what some accounts describe as his dark pilgrimage, as a journey through the strange and impossible geography of the Warp and its adjacent territories, a period of education about what the Eye of Terror actually contained and what its resources were. When he came back, he was different, not broken, not diminished by grief, pointed, like a blade that has been through a forge. His first act was to refuse Horus's memory, any further claim on him. He looked at the sons of Horus squabbling over clones of their dead Primarch, organizing their identity around a man who had failed, and he made a clean break. He destroyed the clones of Horus. He declared himself the rightful successor of the War Master, not Horus's successor, not the inheritor of Horus's failed legacy, but the man who would finish what Horus couldn't. He gathered the warriors who would follow him under his own banner, or painted their armor the black of mourning and rejection and choice, and named them differently. The Black Legion, not the sons of Horus, not carrying his name forward into the future, something new, built on the foundation of what had gone before, but refusing to be defined by it. He formed the Ezekarian, his innermost council of champions. He negotiated with the other traitor legions, a task that required the kind of patience and political intelligence that was astonishing in someone whose primary reputation was built on violence, making pacts and alliances that made the Black Legion into the largest single warband within the Eye of Terror, capable of projecting force in ways that individual legions operating alone could not match. He acquired the Talon of Horus, the Stormbolter and Lightning Claw that had been the War Master's weapon, at making it his own, not a memorial to his Primarch, but a claim of succession, a statement that the work Horus had started was now his work. He acquired Drachnien, the demon sword of ancient and terrible power, a weapon that carried within it an entity of primordial violence that predated the Chaos Gods as modern understanding knows them. And he made the choice that defines him most precisely. He refused the path of the demon Primarchs. He watched what happened to Magnus the Red, consumed by Tzeentch and bound forever to the Warp. He watched Angron transform into something that could barely be called a mind anymore, all rage and hunger without direction. He watched Fulgrim trade his identity for a perfection that had nothing human left in it. These beings were powerful, undeniably, but they were also tools. Whilst they existed at the pleasure of the Chaos Gods, operating within the limits that their divine patrons permitted, unable to cross into real space without specific circumstances being met, dependent on approval they could not ultimately withhold. Abaddon decided he would not become property. He would accept the gifts of chaos. He would carry its marks, wield its weapons, channel its power. He was, by any definition, a champion of chaos undivided, blessed by all four of the ruinous powers simultaneously, something that should not be possible, given how completely the Chaos Gods despise each other, but which Abaddon managed through sheer force of political will and the kind of practical leverage that comes from being the most militarily effective mortal servant any of them currently had. But he would not surrender his agency, or he would use chaos. He would not be used by it. This is the thing that makes Abaddon uniquely dangerous across 10,000 years of the Long War. Most champions of chaos, given sufficient time and sufficient power, eventually stop being people and start being instruments. Abaddon remained, always, the one holding the instrument and deciding where to point it. The Chaos Gods tolerated this, and the fact that they tolerated it, that they considered his utility sufficient to permit his continued independence, tells you something about what they thought of his capabilities. With that power, that agency, that clarity of purpose, and that patience, he launched his first Black Crusade in 781 M31, 500 years after the Horus Heresy, and he began the longest strategic campaign in recorded human history. And Section 3, The Crimson Path, 12 Crusades, one grand design. Here is the central misunderstanding that the Imperium maintained about Abaddon's Black Crusades for nearly 10,000 years. The mistake that the propagandists turned into dark comedy, and that the strategists turned into reassurance they could never quite make themselves believe completely. They thought the Crusades were failures. The first 12 Black Crusades, viewed individually and measured against the obvious tactical objective of breaking through the Cadian Gate and pushing toward Terra, appeared to end in defeat. Each time, Abaddon led his forces through or around the gate's defenses, inflicted tremendous damage, and was eventually pushed back by the combined weight of the Imperium's response each time. But from the perspective of an Imperial strategist looking at a single campaign in isolation, the forces of order had held. Abaddon's record, counted that way, was an apparently unbroken string of 12 defeats spread across millennia. This was not, it turned out, how Abaddon was counting. What the Imperium scholars had failed to piece together, what the Inquisition, for all its vast surveillance networks and its centuries-old campaign to understand Abaddon's true objectives, had never managed to assemble into a coherent picture, was that each of those 12 crusades had specific objectives beyond the apparent military goal, and each one had accomplished what it was actually there to accomplish. The first Black Crusade in 781 M31 was not primarily about breaking through the gate. It was about demonstrating the force that could be assembled and projected from the Eye of Terror. It was about claiming Drachnion, the demon sword that Abaddon had been tracking through the warp-haunted ruins of worlds damaged in the heresy. It was about establishing that the Eye of Terror was not just a refuge, but a base, a source of power from which future operations could be launched with increasing sophistication. And it was, in its own subtle way, a message to the Chaos Gods, to the other traitor legions, and to his own forces, about what the Black Legion was going to become. The Second Crusade, in 597 M32, focused on the systems around Bellis Corona. Abaddon invoked curses and performed rituals that drove deep into the geological and psychic structure of worlds that would not show their effects for centuries. Not spectacular, not visible. That was exactly the point. The Third Crusade desecrated the remains of the Imperial St. Gerstal, a symbolic act of enormous psychological impact to the populations whose faith rested partly on the veneration of that figure, weakening the spiritual foundations of a region in ways that would compound quietly over generations. The Fourth Crusade destroyed the Grand Citadel of the Cromarch, a fortress of immense strategic value in the approaches to the gate. The Fifth Crusade summoned the demon prince Doombreed to consume 2 entire Space Marine chapters, the Warhawks and the Venerators, both destroyed utterly, their names now scratched from the roster of active chapters and recorded only in the Books of Mourning, reducing the permanent military presence in the region. The Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Crusades each accomplished specific goals, punishing rebellious warbands within the Eye who had challenged Black Legion dominance, collecting Space Marine gene seed in quantities that suggested large-scale biological projects, completing ritual sequences that only made sense in retrospect as components of something vast. The Ninth Black Crusade, perhaps the most cunningly concealed of all, targeted specific worlds distributed across a wide area around the Eye of Terror. On the surface, the campaign looked like a complex military operation focused on strangling the naval fortress of Cancephalus. Beneath that surface, Abaddon was doing something that his forces had been doing quietly during several of the previous crusades as well, destroying pylon networks. Not just the pylons on Cadia itself. The research that Belisarius Cawl would eventually complete during the 13th Black Crusade revealed that the Cadian pylon network was not unique. It was the largest and best preserved, but it was part of a galaxy-spanning construction project the Necrons had undertaken during the War in Heaven. Dozens of worlds near the Eye of Terror had their own pylon structures, each one contributing to the overall stability of the region, each one a node in a network that collectively kept the Eye of Terror from expanding beyond its ancient boundaries. Abaddon had been finding them and destroying them for crusades, not all at once. That would have been noticed. Quietly, methodically, one world at a time, over millennia, eliminating the infrastructure that kept his ultimate objective from being achievable. Yet the 10th Crusade attacked and broke the Iron Hand's home system of Medusa, drawing the entire chapter into its own backyard and off the Crusade response roster in a grinding tank battle that one source describes as the largest armored engagement since Talon. The 11th Crusade, the one that caused the most damage in conventional military terms, was also the one that established the strategic geography Abaddon would use in the 13th, attacking across a wide front, testing every defensive position, mapping the Imperium's response times, and identifying the specific weak points that a larger force would later exploit. And then the 12th Crusade, the Gothic War. Running from 139 M41 to 160 M41, fought across the Gothic sector. This was the campaign that secured for Abaddon the weapons he would need for the final act, the Blackstone fortresses. 6 of these ancient structures were known to exist within reach of the Gothic sector, vast mobile weapons platforms of a scale that dwarfed even the largest Imperial warships, constructed from the same Blackstone material as the Cadian pylons, but polarized in the opposite direction. Where Cadian pylons suppressed warp energy, a Blackstone fortress amplified it, focusing and weaponizing the power of the Imperium into beams of reality-disrupting force that could unmake stars. The Aeldari called them the Talismans of Vol, and they allied with the Imperium against Abaddon specifically to prevent him from claiming them. They failed. He escaped with 2. One he would arm as the Planet Killer, the devastating weapon that would eliminate stragglers and accelerating the timeline when the time came. And the other he would name the Will of Eternity, and it would serve as his command post and his ultimate weapon in the siege of Cadia. Step back from any one of these crusades. Stop seeing them as individual events. Look at the whole timeline. All 12 campaigns spread across nearly 9,000 years, and a picture resolves out of what had looked like chaos. Each crusade weakened the pylon network that kept the Eye of Terror contained. Each crusade reduced the permanent military presence defending the gate. Each crusade improved the Black Legion's understanding of Imperial defensive doctrines, identifying exactly which approaches would work and which would be stopped. Each crusade secured resources and allies and weapons needed for the final campaign. Each crusade was a brick in a wall that Abaddon was building, one millennium at a time, and that when complete would be high enough for him to see terror from. The Crimson Path, they called it within the forces of chaos. Not just a military route from the Eye of Terror to the Sol system. A plan, a preparation, a patient, methodical dismantling of everything that stood in the way, conducted with such long timescales that no individual defender or institution lived long enough to recognize what was being built around them. By the final years of the 41st millennium, Abaddon was ready to place the last brick. Section 4. The Cadian Gate, where reality holds its breath. There is a region of space in the segmentum obscurus that doesn't behave the way that the rest of space does. All around the Eye of Terror, that roiling, approximately 20,000 light-year wound in the fabric of reality, where the warp and physical space overlap completely, where the chaos gods hold something approaching real estate, where the laws of nature operate on a referendum basis and often lose. The fabric of space is profoundly and permanently unstable. Warp storms rage perpetually at the boundaries, making navigation in that region a lottery, where the default prize is death or something worse. Ships entering without extreme caution and specialized equipment have a tendency not to exit at all, or to exit somewhere they did not intend, at a time they did not expect, carrying passengers who may not be who they were when they entered, except in one place. A patch of space to the galactic southeast of the Eye, where the storm's inexplicably quiet, where the boundary between the warp and real space stabilizes to something that, while still more treacherous than deep space far from the Eye, is at least navigable. A corridor of comparative calm, wide enough for a fleet to move through with something resembling reliability. This was the Cadian Gate, and it existed, had existed for millions of years before humanity reached it, because of something buried in the skin of a world, planted there by minds that were already ancient when the first primitive humans were scratching marks on cave walls. The Cadian pylons. 5,810 of them stood on the surface of Cadia in the final years of the 41st millennium, each one rising precisely half a kilometer above the planetary surface and sinking a quarter kilometer into the bedrock below. No two were identical in design. Each one was unique in its specific configuration of the blackstone material from which they were all constructed. But every one of them was connected to the others through the planet-wide network they collectively formed, each one contributing to a combined field that suppressed and dampened warp energies across a vast region of surrounding space. The Adeptus Mechanicus studied them for thousands of years and understood very little. The substance they were made from, the Imperium called it Blackstone, the Necrons knew it by the name Noctilith, had clear significance, but resisted the standard analytical approaches of tech priest methodology. The pylons were obviously alien, obviously ancient, obviously functionally important in ways that the Mechanicus could document without fully comprehending. Yet they generated an anti-psychic field. That much was demonstrable. What it was doing to the Eye of Terror, that took until the very end of the 41st millennium to understand properly. The truth, finally confirmed at catastrophic cost during the 13th Black Crusade, was that the pylons were Necron in origin. Built by that ancient, terrifying civilization of immortal machine beings during the war in heaven. A conflict so old and so total that it consumed hundreds of star systems and reshaped the galaxy's psychic infrastructure. A conflict whose shockwaves are still propagating through the biology and culture of every sapient species alive today. The Necrons built the pylons as defenses against the psychic power of the Old Ones and the beings the Old Ones had created, the races that would eventually become the Aeldari and others. The warp was the Old Ones' domain and their weapon. Suppress the warp, deny the enemy their advantage, create zones of real space where psychic power was dampened to the point of uselessness, where the advantages of warp-dependent species were negated, where the Necrons' own lack of souls became a tactical asset rather than the existential horror that the Necron Tyre had originally understood it to be. When the Eye of Terror tore itself into existence, born from the catastrophic collective psychic event that destroyed the Eldari civilization and birthed Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and sensation, the pylon network on Cadia was old, and some of it was damaged or buried or simply dormant. But enough remained active, enough of the network survived in functional form, that the expansion of the newly born Eye was contained. The rift could grow in some directions. It could not grow into the Cadian Gate. Like a river finding a wall and routing around it, the warp surge found the pylon field and could not fully cross. This was, for 10,000 years, the lock. The planet that grew up around that lock reflects the specific pressures of existing directly adjacent to the most dangerous place in the known galaxy. Every Cadian citizen was a soldier by constitutional necessity, not by choice or circumstance or voluntary enlistment. The planet's social organization was built around military readiness at every level. 1 in every 10 Cadians, regardless of aptitude or preference, served in the Interior Guard, the planetary defense force that maintained Cadia's own security. The famous Cadian shock troopers, Imperial Guard regiments recruited from Cadia that even Space Marines acknowledged as among the finest baseline human soldiers in existence, were the product of a culture where children learned to field strip and reassemble a laser gun before they were reliably literate, where wilderness survival training in the harsh Cadian climate was considered basic life education rather than military preparation, where the expectation of violence was so thoroughly integrated into everyday existence that what other cultures might call courage, Cadians simply called getting on with things. The fortress cities, the casas, Charm as the Cadians called them, were engineering achievements that illustrated the single-minded application of centuries of accumulated military science to the problem of defending against the largest warp rift in the galaxy. Casa Kraf, Casa Sonnen, Casa Holm. The name means something like citadel in Old Cadian, and the names are accurate. These were not cities that happened to be fortified. They were fortifications that happened to house civilians necessary for the military operation. Walls that could absorb orbital bombardment under most circumstances. Macro cannon batteries positioned to cover every approach from terrain features that had been mapped and militarized over millennia. Underground networks capable of sustaining populations for extended periods of siege. Orbital defense platforms that coordinated with ground-based systems in interlocking fields of fire that made simply flying over Cadia an exercise in controlled statistical terror. The Cadian sky showed the eye of terror on clear nights. That distant smear of impossible color, violet and red, and things that didn't quite map onto the standard spectrum. The visual signature of a place where reality had a permanent open wound. The Cadians looked at it. Every generation of Cadians looked at it, standing on the ramparts of their fortress cities, and understood in the most direct and immediate way possible what they were defending against. And why. No propaganda was required. The eye was right there. The eye was always right there. And the Cadians stood between it and everything else. And several Space Marine chapters had been founded specifically for service in the defense of the Cadian Gate and the surrounding sectors. 20 chapters of the Astartes Praeses existed in permanent rotation through the region, providing the kind of rapid response capability that the eye's constant pressure demanded. Battle Fleet Cardia was the most battle-hardened fleet formation in the Imperium, its crews and officers shaped by generations of engagement with Chaos Raiders and the occasional larger incursion. Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus maintained their own surveillance networks, watching for the specific psychic signatures that preceded major chaos activity. Listening posts dotted every approach. Everyone knew another Black Crusade was coming. The question had never been whether. The Inquisition had never pretended otherwise. The Cadian High Command had spent decades preparing for it. Every regiment stationed in the sector had been selected partly for psychological resilience, the ability to do their job in the presence of genuine demonic horror, without the kind of faith crisis that could compromise a unit in the middle of an engagement. When the final signs started appearing, in the closing years of the 41st Millennium, the Watchers recognized them. They had been trained to recognize them. What they had not been trained to recognize was the full scope of what was being assembled on the other side of the eye, because no doctrine written by mortal minds had ever seriously modeled what 10,000 years of dedicated preparation would actually produce. Section 5, The Storm Gathers, Omens, Plague, and the Knife in the Dark. The 41st Millennium did not end quietly. It never had. Not in any year of its 1,000 years. But the final decades were something different, a convergence of crises that, looked at individually, each seemed like the kind of thing the Imperium could manage. Looked at together, they had the quality of a net being drawn tight. Psyche manifestations increased across hundreds of worlds simultaneously, outstripping the Black Ship's capacity to collect and process the gifted and the dangerous. The warp grew rougher in ways that astropaths described as the background noise of the universe turning louder and more aggressive. Rebellions and cult activities that should have been isolated incidents connected themselves across systems in patterns that the most paranoid inquisitors could barely document fast enough. And every front of the long war seemed to flare simultaneously. The Tyranids pressing from the galactic south, the orcs regrouping after their great failed assault on Armageddon, the Tau expanding their sphere in the east, and from within, the constant insurgency of chaos cults and corrupted leadership, and the slow creep of warp influence through everything from the water supply to the devotional practices of imperial priests. Around the Cadian Gate specifically, the signs that something unprecedented was approaching began as whispers and became shouts over the course of years. Space hulks emerged from warp transit in numbers that exceeded historical averages by enough to attract immediate attention. These vast, terrible conglomerations of fused ships, each one a floating ecosystem of horrors, appeared in the Cadian sector with a frequency that suggested they were being pushed from the eye's interior rather than drifting naturally, and they carried something beyond the usual cargo of horrors. Embedded within the populations of these space hulks, spreading through the crews of vessels that had contact with them, was a disease. The plague of unbelief was the first weapon of the 13th Black Crusade, and it was deployed years before any fleet emerged from the eye. A creation of Nurgle, the chaos god of entropy and pestilence, it worked through populations with a specific and terrifying progression. It killed. That much was immediately apparent. What was less immediately apparent, until the first of the dead started moving again, was what happened after the killing. Or the plague reanimated its victims in the manner of all Nurgle's most beloved gifts, not undead in the traditional sense, not possessed by demons, but bodies kept in a crude approximation of function by the biological creativity of the Lord of Decay, lurching through the motions of existence with none of the interior content that makes existence worth experiencing. These shambling masses spread the disease. The diseases spread chaos in the literal sense. Panic, breakdown of institutional function, the specific kind of social dissolution that comes when the fundamental category of who is alive and who is dead stops providing the reliable guidance it normally does. Simultaneously, a figure appeared in the afflicted sectors who called himself the voice of the Emperor. He traveled through the zones of unrest, gathering followers from among those who had lost their priests and their administrative structures and their certainties, speaking with apparent authority about the Emperor's will and the meaning of the suffering being visited upon the populace. He was convincing. He was, in many ways, exactly what desperate people needed. An authority figure with answers, in a situation where all the existing authority figures were either dead or demonstrably failing. The Inquisition identified him as a threat and moved to capture him. They failed, repeatedly, because the voice of the Emperor was not the sincere imperial devotee his presentation suggested. The Alpha Legion, those masters of identity and infiltration, had placed an operative precisely where the situation demanded one, and the operative was very good at his work. Typhus, in The Herald of Nurgle, the figure who had been the Death Guard's first champion and remained one of its most potent, drove his plague fleets into the Agrippina sector with a fury that nearly broke that critical Forge world's defenses. Only the intervention of the Howling Griffin's Space Marines turned the campaign into the kind of extended grinding engagement that neither side could decisively win. And grinding it was. Trench warfare in near inhospitable conditions. The kind of battle where the toll is measured not in tactical victories, but in the accumulated physical and psychological cost of existing in the front lines of a conflict conducted in conditions that Nurgle apparently found aesthetically pleasing. In other sectors of the Cadian Gate's perimeter, the Emperor's children, Night Lords.
Okay, I want to pause here for just a second and give you my honest take on all of this, because I think it matters. The 13th Black Crusade is the event I personally point to whenever someone asks me why I fell so deep into 40k lore, because on the surface it looks like a war story. Big fleets, fortress worlds, legendary characters, and it is all of that, but what genuinely gets me every time I go back through it, is the patience of it. The idea that one mind spent 10,000 years working toward a single outcome, And the people standing in the way of that outcome had no way of seeing the full picture because no single human life was long enough to watch it unfold. That is not a power fantasy. That is tragedy dressed up as a war game. And I think that is what makes Warhammer 40K unlike anything else in science fiction. That is why I think the story deserves the full treatment. So let's keep going.
And Alpha Legion conducted raids and operations of a kind that seemed targeted at exhausting Imperial response capacity, rather than achieving specific territorial objectives. This too was deliberate. Every response required from the Imperial commanders defending outlying sectors was a response unavailable for the main event that was coming. Every regiment committed to chasing Alpha Legion infiltrators was a regiment not positioned to reinforce Cadia when the hammer fell. The opening moves of the 13th Black Crusade were masterclasses in strategic distraction. Make the opponents spend their chips defending positions that aren't the real target, so that when the real target is struck, they have nothing left to spend. The Imperium's response to these accumulating threats was as impressive as it could be given the constraints of governing 1,000,000 worlds across distances that make even the fastest communication take months or years. The muster on Cadia began well before the main fleet emerged from the Eye. Every Cadian regiment that could be recalled from other deployments was ordered home. Titan legions prepared to march from their home foundries. 41 Space Marine chapters mobilized in response to the emergency requisition. The assembled forces in the final days before the main assault were, by any historical measure, enormous. Regiments from a dozen different cultures and fighting styles, elite warriors and conscript masses, orbital defenses and ground fortifications, and every piece of military hardware the administratum could source and transport to the system. Their morale, by most accounts, was remarkable. They knew what was coming. They had, in many cases, spent their whole lives in the knowledge that this was coming. And when it arrived, they intended to meet it the way their traditions said to. Then the Volscani cataphracts arrived. The Volscani regiments were Cadian. That is the first terrible thing about what happened next. They were not foreign troops of uncertain loyalty, not newly recruited forces without a track record. They were Cadian soldiers, with a history of service against chaos, who had looked at what their previous engagements had cost them, who had processed the weight of what they were about to face again, and had made a calculation somewhere in the private arithmetic of collective terror. They could not do this again. They did not formally pledge themselves to the dark gods. There is no record of a ritual dedication ceremony, no evidence of possession or psychic coercion. They were simply soldiers who had decided to survive by another means. They landed at Casa Tirok during the Grand Muster, their vehicles carrying the honored markings of Cadian regiments. They were welcomed with the trust due to forces who carried those markings. They were assigned positions in the Great Assembly. And then, without warning, they dropped the pretense. The Leviathan command vehicles, massive, armored mobile fortresses that housed the Cadian High Command, had their void shields stripped by a coordinated assault before the senior officers understood what was happening. Boarding parties cut through the breached armor with the efficiency of soldiers who had rehearsed this specific action. The Lord Castellan, the planetary governor, the admiral, the assembled flag officers who had spent years preparing for this moment. All of them were killed in minutes in what was planned as a decapitation strike, precise enough to remove every person capable of immediately assuming high command from the equation simultaneously. In that moment, with the high command dead and the assembled forces suddenly leaderless at the worst possible time, everything could have collapsed. The Chaos Assault was beginning its main movement. The forces defending Cadia had just lost every senior coordinator they possessed. One person with one very specific set of capabilities prevented the decapitation strike from achieving its intended strategic effect. Colonel Ursakar E. Creed, commanding officer of the 8th Cadian Regiment. He was not a tall man particularly, or impressive to look at in any conventional way. Wide-shouldered, heavy-jawed, almost always smoking, carrying himself with the specific economy of movement that comes from having spent a career making large decisions in small windows of time. What he carried that was unusual was not visible exactly, but everyone who served with him knew it was there. He understood battles at a level that outpaced his ability to explain his reasoning, issuing orders that seemed counterintuitive until the situation developed far enough that the thinking behind them became clear. Subordinates who had learned to trust him had stopped second-guessing. Subordinates who hadn't learned yet quickly either did or became casualties of their own doubts. Creed rallied the surviving forces at Casa Tirok in a manner that witnesses later struggled to describe adequately because it happened so fast, was so comprehensive, and was so obviously correct in retrospect while being so non-obvious in the immediate chaos of the moment. He organized the counterattack against the Volskani cataphracts. He secured the body of the slain governor before it could be desecrated. But he took personal command of units that had no idea who to report to and gave them direction that stopped the lateral collapse of the defensive structure from becoming a full rout. He understood, within minutes, what had been done and what its purpose was, not as intelligence analysis, but as the kind of immediate tactical pattern recognition that had been the defining characteristic of his career. When the dust settled and the surviving commanders assembled to determine what was left of their chain of command, Creed demanded the rank of Lord Castellan. Not planetary governor, the governance mechanisms had their own continuity provisions. The Lord Castellan was a special title, only granted in crisis, which conferred absolute military authority over all forces on and around Cardia for the duration of the emergency. Well, it was exactly the kind of centralized command the situation required, and it was exactly the kind of authority structure that the previous incident had demonstrated was dangerously vulnerable to decapitation attacks. Centralizing it again in a single person was a risk, but the alternative was the kind of committee-based coordination that chaos forces exploit by nature. The War Master's representative agreed. Creed accepted the rank and immediately dispatched requests for aid across the entire sector, while simultaneously organizing every remaining military asset on Chaldea into a coherent defensive structure. He sent Kasakin strike teams, special operations forces of the highest quality, directly into the Eye of Terror on reconnaissance missions, seeking intelligence on where and when the main blow would fall. Those teams made it in. Some of them made it very deep, deep enough to reach the demon world of Earthwart, far enough inside the Eye that the things they saw would have unmade soldiers of lesser mental training. What they saw, just before the planet died beneath them, was the shadow of the planet killer growing in the sky above. Earthwart was vaporized, and from the churning psychic aftermath of its destruction, a fleet began to emerge that made the initial intelligence reports seem almost understated in their descriptions. Hundreds of warships, troop transports in numbers that staggered the count, the Terminus Est, Typhus's legendary plague ship, its hull festooned with the symbols of Nurgle's favor, and the massed biological horror of a vessel that has served the Lord of Decay long enough to become a work of art in his disturbing aesthetic. The Fortress of Agony, another vessel whose name precisely describes its history. Plague hulks of the Death Guard, blood-red warships belonging to the World Eaters. The Baroque, corrupted luxury cruisers of the Emperor's children. The dark, angular vessels of the Night Lords. And at the center of it, anchoring the whole formation, two objects that made the experienced officers at the Imperial listening posts reach for their private prayers without quite realizing they were doing it. The Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, the vessel from which the heresy was commanded, still sailing through the decades and centuries and millennia, still carrying on its hull the marks of 10,000 years of warfare, now Abaddon's personal command. And beside it, so large it generated its own navigational interference, in a structure that shouldn't have been mobile at all, the Will of Eternity, a blackstone fortress, moving through space like a mountain range that had been given engines and a purpose. The 13th Black Crusade had truly begun. Section 6. The Black Fleet arrives. War in the Void. The first engagements of the 13th Black Crusade were fought in space, and they set the tone for everything that followed. They were tremendous displays of courage and tactical skill on the Imperial side. They were insufficient. Battlefleet Cadia was not an ordinary fleet formation. It was the fleet that existed specifically because Cadia existed. Assembled, equipped, trained, and maintained at peak readiness for the explicit purpose of confronting, whatever came through the Eye of Terror. Its commanders had spent careers studying Chaos Fleet tactics. Its crews had drilled for the kind of engagement that most other Imperial fleets only encountered in training scenarios. Its ships were the best maintained in their class because the Adeptus Mechanicus understood that poorly maintained vessels in this region of space were not just a tactical problem, but an existential threat to the entire sector. When Admiral Quarren's picket fleet first detected the emergence of Abaddon's armada from warp transit, they engaged with the discipline and ferocity that generations of purpose had built into them. They contested every approach. They refused every opportunity to break contact and run when staying in the fight cost them dearly. They fought the kind of battle that naval strategists write case studies about, using every terrain feature that void combat offers and every tactical asymmetry that a smaller, more maneuverable force can exploit against a numerically superior enemy. They were magnificent, and they were not enough. Not against that fleet, not against 3 combined Chaos war fleets, plus the Planet Killer, plus the Will of Eternity, all moving in coordinated patterns that required a unified command capability that Chaos forces almost never possessed. The coordination was itself the evidence of Abaddon's specific strategic genius, that he could take the inherently fractious, competing, mutually hostile forces of Chaos and impose on them the kind of unity of effort that turned their individual capabilities into a combined weapon. The Chaos Gods competed for influence within the fleet as they always did, their mortal champions jockeying for position and favor. But Abaddon held it together with the same cold, patient authority he had been exercising for 10,000 years, and so the fleet moved as one. The Will of Eternity was the tactical and psychological centerpiece of everything. Its sheer scale rewrote the tactical equations of every engagement it participated in simply by being present. Its hull of blackstone absorbed energies that would have cracked any conventional warship. Its warp cannon, the weapon that had made the Blackstone fortresses so feared during the Gothic War, could, if correctly aimed and given the right conditions, destroy a planet. Abaddon established his personal command post within it, directing the entire campaign from inside a weapon of unimaginable power, and which was either extraordinarily confident or demonstrated a very clear understanding of what that weapon's presence meant for any potential counterstrike. Against this force, Battlefleet Cardia fought and bled. Other fleets raced toward the system as the emergency communications spread outward. Battlefleet Corona, Battlefleet Scarus, elements of Battlefleet Gothic called back from other theaters. But interstellar distances mean that fleets in transit are measured in weeks and months, not hours, and Cadia was being hit right now. Into the deteriorating naval situation came something that had been making its own way to the fight: the Phalanx. As the Imperial Fist's legendary mobile fortress monastery, a structure so large that calling it a ship undersells it the way calling the Pacific Ocean a body of water undersells that, had been in transit since the emergency calls went out. Captain Tor Garadon commanded it, and he brought it with every company embarked, every weapon system at maximum readiness, every available resource pointed at the problem. The Phalanx's arrival changed the tactical calculus in the void. Not decisively. The Chaos fleet was still overwhelming in numbers, and the Will of Eternity was still there, but enough to buy time. Enough to make Abaddon slow down and reassess. Enough for the extraordinary events aboard the Blackstone Fortress itself to unfold. But Wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl of the Space Wolves proposed the direct boarding of the Will of Eternity with the simplicity of expression that characterized Space Wolves' tactical thinking at its finest. If you can't shoot it down from the outside, you go inside and take it apart from within. He organized 200 Space Marines from multiple chapters, loaded them onto the Space Wolves vessel, Firemane's Fang, and drove that ship against the hull of a structure that should have been impervious to boarding by any force that size. They penetrated it. And then, something strange happened that no one has fully explained. Strange even by the standards of what happens inside a Blackstone fortress. Bulkheads that had been sealed opened. Defensive systems that should have been tracking the borders disengaged. But the route to the fortress's core systems seemed almost to clear itself, as if the Will of Eternity had its own preferences about who it wanted to reach its heart. Dravura Morkath, Abaddon's appointed commander of the fortress, who had some complicated personal connection to both Abaddon and the fortress itself, could not maintain full control of the structure. The Will of Eternity had, apparently, a will of its own. Abaddon came in person to stop the borders. That decision, to come himself rather than trust the defense to subordinates, speaks to how seriously he took the threat of what Bloodhowl's forces might accomplish if they reached the core. He arrived in the fortress's depths and fought with the full weight of what he was, a being shaped and hardened by 10,000 years of war, carrying weapons that operated on a fundamental level of wrongness that most warriors never encountered, blessed by 4 chaos gods who each considered him their most valuable mortal asset. Bloodhowl's wolves took devastating casualties. Bloodhowl himself was mortally wounded fighting Abaddon directly. But Bloodhowl had set a trap, and traps don't require the person who set them to be alive when they spring. While Abaddon was focused on destroying the boarding party, the space wolves who had reached the core had sabotaged the shield systems. The capacitors were destroyed. The Will of Eternity's shields failed. Outside, the Phalanx had been waiting for exactly this. The shot that the Phalanx fired at the Will of Eternity when its shields dropped was everything the Fortress Monastery had, every weapon system brought to bear simultaneously, targeting a single point, delivering more destructive energy in a single coordinated salvo than most planets receive in a standard year from their star. The Will of Eternity did not survive it intact. A third of the Black Fleet nearby was destroyed in the detonation. The Blackstone Fortress came apart, its pieces falling into orbital trajectories around Cadia, chunks of ancient alien engineering drifting in the planet's gravity like the ruins of a catastrophe, which, in every meaningful sense, they were. On the surface of Cadia, word of the Will of Eternity's destruction traveled through the defensive lines faster than any official communication. It carried with it something the defenders had been fighting without for most of the campaign. A sense that this could be survived, that the thing they had most feared had been destroyed by exactly the kind of desperate sacrifice and desperate bravery that Cadian tradition promised was sufficient. Aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Abaddon received the same news. He looked at the wreckage of his most powerful weapon drifting in orbit above Cadia. He looked at the planet below, still stubbornly, infuriatingly intact, and he began calculating the contingency that he had always known might be necessary. Section 7. Cadia under siege. The ground war in all its ferocity. The battle on Cadia's surface was not a single engagement. It was dozens of simultaneous engagements fought across a planet-sized fortress over weeks and months, each one a story in its own right, each one contributing to a strategic picture whose resolution only made sense from very high altitude. Whilst the ground assault began with the assets Abaddon had planned for this phase, the Iron Warriors provided the backbone of the siege operations, those Traitor Legion's space marines who had spent 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, doing nothing but refining and deepening their already exceptional expertise in the destruction of fixed defenses. They brought a methodical patience to the reduction of Cadia's casters that the Chaos forces generally lacked, and it was devastatingly effective. They did not rush walls. They did not make frontal assaults that would be broken on the fortification's prepared fires. They identified the structural weak points, brought appropriate assets to bear on each one, and worked through Cadia's defenses the way a very skilled person works through a difficult lock, not by force, but by understanding. At World Eaters pressed where the Iron Warriors identified that the defenders' nerves were most stretched, feeding on the specific kind of combat where the psychological pressure could turn disciplined troops into broken ones simply through the unremitting intensity of facing creatures that clearly could not be frightened or reasoned with. The Night Lords specialized in exactly the kind of atmospheric atrocity that turned a section of the defensive perimeter into a crisis that pulled resources from elsewhere. The Wordbearers conducted their rituals in the captured territories, unleashing warp storms and demonic manifestations that further compressed the surviving defended areas. By the time the full weight of Abaddon's ground assault was in motion, only a handful of Cadian casters remained in Imperial hands. As Casa Craft became the anchor, the last fortress of sufficient scale to serve as a genuine command center, the place around which the surviving defenders organized themselves by necessity, Creed's headquarters was there. The Space Marine forces that had survived the initial landings gathered there, Space Wolves and Dark Angels and Black Templars, and representatives from at least a dozen other chapters, each with their own command structures, their own preferences, their own assessments of tactical priorities. Managing this coalition was a second battle Creed had to fight simultaneously with the actual battle. Space Marine chapters are not accustomed to taking operational direction from mortal officers, as in the specific configurations of pride and tradition and capability that distinguish one chapter from another made unified command a constant negotiation. Creed managed it through the simplest possible means, being demonstrably right, often enough, quickly enough, about things that mattered enough, that disagreeing with him became a choice that could be measured in casualties and justified only with difficulty. Space Wolves in particular responded to demonstrated tactical ability in a way that made Creed effective with them, in a manner that purely rank-based authority would not have achieved. The assault on the Null Array, the defensive installation that was preventing the debris of the Will of Eternity from being used as a weapon against the planet, was entrusted to Akanthos. He was Abaddon's most favored champion, a cornate warrior of extraordinary violence and strategic competence, the kind of being whose faith in violence had been validated so completely over so long that the violence had become its own kind of theology. He led the Hounds of Abaddon, his personal warband, in a drive toward the Null Array that swept through multiple defensive lines, with a directness that gave defenders very little time to prepare for what was coming before it arrived. The defense of those lines was conducted by, among others, 2 canonesses of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, Eleanor and Genevieve, twin commanders of the Adepta Sororitas contingent on Cadia, who met the Hounds of Abaddon with everything they and their sisters could bring to bear. They died. Akanthos reached the Null Array complex. The Null Array was destroyed. The protection against the Will of Eternity's cannon, or rather the protection against whatever remained of the Will of Eternity being used in other ways, was gone. Down in the planet's geological foundations, simultaneously, 2 of the most unlikely collaborators in the history of either of their respective civilizations were racing against everything. Belisarius Cawl had arrived on Cardia following guidance from the Harlequins. Those mercurial, terrifying performance artists of the Aeldari god of the dead, who had their own reasons for wanting certain outcomes in the 13th Black Crusade, and had been carefully engineering the convergences that made those outcomes possible. Cawl had studied the pylons of Cadia and of other worlds. He had cracked the theoretical understanding of Noctilith that the Imperium had been unable to achieve for millennia, and had reached a conclusion that changed everything he thought he knew about what the pylons could do. They weren't just stabilizers. They weren't just the reason the Cadian Gate existed. Fully activated, operating in concert across the complete network, they could push the Eye of Terror back. Not incrementally, completely. Close the wound that had defined the strategic situation of the entire Segmentum Obscurus for 10,000 years. This required knowledge of Necron technology that Cawl did not possess. It required, specifically, someone who had been present when the pylons were built. Someone who had watched them constructed and understood their deep operational principles in ways that even the most thorough post hoc analysis could not fully recover from studying the finished structures. This is where Trazyn the Infinite entered the story, and the fact that a Necron overlord from an entirely different galaxy quadrant chose to involve himself in the defense of Cadia is one of those moments that 40K lore uses to remind you that nothing in this universe is simple. Trazyn's primary concerns were archival and acquisitive. He maintained a collection. His collection was being damaged by the upheavals caused by the Black Crusade's effects on the broader psychic environment of the galaxy. He found this unacceptable. he traced the disturbances. He went to Cadia, and when he found Call there, by working on the pylons with an urgency that even the Archmagos' centuries-calibrated patience was barely sufficient to contain, Trazyn recognized a problem he could help solve in the specific way that Trazyn helps with problems, by contributing knowledge and capability toward a resolution that also happens to serve his own interests in ways that he does not fully disclose. Together, in the tunnels beneath Cadia's surface, the Archmagos and the Necron Overlord worked to activate the full pylon network. And while they worked, on the surface above them, the last act of the campaign was playing out around the question of whether they would finish before everything else was lost. Saint Celestine descended like a comet, wrapped in fire that was not entirely physical, carrying the presence of something that operated on the level of the miraculous, in a universe where the miraculous was real but rare. She arrived at exactly the moment when the defenders of Cassacraft were closest to the thing they had been holding themselves back from: genuine despair. She brought with her sisters of battle who had been lost in the warp for over 1,000 years and had emerged from that transit, impossibly, still armed and still willing. She brought, most immediately, the resurrection of Eleanor and Genevieve, the two canonesses Ercanthos had killed. She called them back and transformed them into the Gemini Superior, her constant companions, consecrated warriors bearing the mark of something that transcended what battle death normally meant. And then together, they killed Ercanthos, now the demon prince. Because he had completed his ascension during the campaign, his service to Khorne finally recognized with the transformation into a fully spiritual being of devastating power, was destroyed by a living saint and two women who had been dead and had been brought back, and whose return carried a weight of symbolism that the Cadian soldiers who witnessed it would be talking about until they died. In a campaign full of desperate moments, that moment was perhaps the most purely defiant. The pylons activated. The anti-psychic field spread across the Cadian system, expanding outward from the planet with a force that even non-psychic observers described as a change in the quality of air, a resolution of a tension that they hadn't consciously recognized they'd been holding. The Eye of Terror began to contract. Demons across the battlefield flickered and destabilized, pulled back toward a warp that was being compressed against a newly restored barrier. Abaddon's demonic forces, a significant portion of his fighting strength, began to dissolve. And then Abaddon came down personally, and the last act of the campaign began. Section 8. The Pylon's Wake and the Final Gambit. The pylon network's full activation was felt by everyone who had any sensitivity to the nature of the warp, and by many who didn't. The chaos forces on the surface experienced it as a crushing, soul-diminishing pressure, the specific sensation that comes when the power they drew on for everything from their enhanced combat abilities to their demonic reinforcements suddenly encountered something that was actively pushing back. Abaddon's power was not immune, and even the Warmaster of Chaos Undivided felt the pylon's effect as a narrowing of the space available to him, a thinning of the connection between himself and the powers that had shaped and gifted him over 10,000 years. He came to Cadia because waiting on the vengeful spirit was no longer an option. The accounts of Abaddon's personal combat on Cadia's surface are fragmentary and were assembled from survivor testimony that necessarily reflects the experience of being present during something that defied the narrative categories available to human experience. What is agreed upon is this: he fought his way through the surviving defensive lines with a momentum that suggested the specific physics of that battlefield applied differently to him than they did to everything else. He was looking for something. He found St. Celestine first. The duel between Abaddon and Celestine was a collision between two different kinds of impossible. The Warmaster of Chaos, sustained by 10,000 years of accumulated power from 4 gods simultaneously, wielding weapons that had been forged or claimed or corrupted by millennia of terrible history, against a living saint whose connection to the Emperor's divine will made her as close to an instrument of genuine holiness as the 41st Millennium could produce. They fought across the ruins of fortifications that had been magnificent engineering achievements a few weeks before the campaign began, and the collision of what each of them represented left marks on the surrounding reality that persisted long after both of them had moved on. The pylons were working against Celestine too. And the anti-psychic field that was unraveling the demon legions and weakening Abaddon's connection to the warp also dimmed the miraculous power that sustained a being whose existence was fundamentally psychic in nature. She fought him at reduced capacity and eventually fell under the weight of what he was. Creed was his next target. What passed between Abaddon the Despoiler and Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed in those moments is one of the stories that gets compressed into legend very quickly. An entirely mortal man, a career soldier whose achievements had been built on intelligence and tactical instinct rather than any supernatural quality, facing the supreme champion of chaos in person. Creed didn't run. The accounts suggest he fired at Abaddon. The evidence suggests the pistol shot accomplished approximately what you would expect a pistol shot to accomplish against the bearer of Terminator-grade corrupted armor and the accumulated blessings of 4 gods. He lost fingers in the attempt. He kept fighting, and then Celestine, wounded and flickering, gathered what remained of her connection to the divine and drove her blade into the back of the War Master of Chaos. The wound reached something, not enough to kill him. Abaddon has survived things that should have ended him before, and the blessings of the Chaos Gods include a considerable amount of insurance against permanent death, but enough to hurt. Enough to make clear that staying on a planet whose pylon network was actively dampening his power while his demonic forces evaporated around him was not a position from which he could achieve anything more. He teleported, back to the vengeful spirit, out of reach of the pylons, and he gave an order. The pieces of the will of eternity were still in orbit. Thousands of tons of blackstone, ancient engineering of unimaginable sophistication, now inert and tumbling slowly through Cadia's gravity well in orbits that were naturally decaying. They were going to come down eventually regardless. Abaddon simply helped them along. His engineers attached engines to the largest pieces. They calculated trajectories, and they aimed those trajectories at Cadia's surface, specifically at the locations where the pylon network was densest and most critical to the overall anti-psychic field. When the debris struck, the effect was geophysical as much as military. These were not bombs or weapons in any conventional sense. They were mountains of alien alloy falling from orbit, with the momentum that orbital mechanics generate when given sufficient time and mass. The impacts punched through the planetary crust. The shockwaves propagated through the geological structures that had been Cadia's bedrock, the same geology that had held the pylons in place for millions of years. The pylons shattered, not everywhere simultaneously, but in a cascade. As the network lost nodes, the remaining nodes were forced to carry more load, and the anti-psychic field began to degrade in sections, and each degradation made the next one faster until the field collapsed entirely. The Eye of Terror, which had been contracting under the pylon network's pressure, stopped, held for a moment in the dynamic tension between the collapsing field and its own natural expansion. And then, as the pylons failed completely, it began to grow. Section 9. Cadia Falls. The death of a world. The geological process of a planet breaking apart is not something that happens quickly when measured against human timescales, but it is also not something that can be made to feel distant when you are standing on the surface of the planet it is happening to. The survivors who made it off Cadia describe the experience in terms that converge on the same details. The sound first. Something below the normal threshold of hearing, felt in the chest rather than processed by the ears. A vibration in the ground that was different from the fighting, different from the bombardment, that had a quality of wrongness that bodies recognized before minds did. Then the sky changing. Not the battle in the sky. That had been constant. The sky changing in a different way. The pieces of the will of eternity came in at angles visible from the surface for the final seconds before impact. Each one was enormous. The smallest fragments were still structures the size of small mountains, and the largest were regions of the fortress itself, blackstone sections that had survived the phalanx's initial shot and then the subsequent detonation. They hit across the continent of Cadia Tertius primarily, the densest concentration of pylon fields on the planet, and the results were the kind of event that geological language has categories for, but human emotional language struggles with. The pylons failed. The last ones gutted out over minutes, each failure accelerating the next, the network collapsing like a grid, losing power station by station. And as the pylons failed, the warp came back in. Not the flickering, unstable demonic manifestations that the pylon field had been suppressing throughout the battle. The full weight of the Imperium, rushing through the ruptures torn in the boundary between real space and warp space by the impacts and the psychic backlash of 1,000,000 deaths and the collapse of a field that had been holding it back for millions of years. Rifts opened across the surface. Not just the localized tears that demon summoning produced, but fundamental breaches in reality that connected Cadia to the Eye of Terror in ways that the Eye's expansion was immediately pouring through. Demons materialized fully, not as the weakened, flickering things the pylon field had been generating, but as solid, real, complete expressions of warp entity in physical form, fed by the raw chaos energy flooding into the space. Creed organized the evacuation. This is stated simply, and it should not be. Organizing the evacuation of a planet that is actively breaking apart, in the middle of a battle that had not ended but had changed character, with demonic forces materializing behind lines and the ground itself becoming unreliable, but required the application of every skill Creed possessed at maximum intensity across every available channel simultaneously. He directed the remaining military assets to hold specific corridors, not trying to hold Cadia, which was lost, but trying to hold the routes from the surviving population centers to the landing zones where transports could still reach them. He managed the chaos of panicked civilians and exhausted troops and damaged vehicles with the same calm certainty he had brought to every crisis since the Tyrock Field's betrayal. 3 million people, in the end, got off Cadia before the world tore itself apart. 3 million from a planet that had housed many times that many before the campaign began. Each one of those 3 million was a story. Each shuttle that lifted off from a landing pad cracking beneath it was a story. Or each soldier who held a perimeter long enough for one more transport to clear the atmosphere was a story that will never be fully told, because most of those soldiers didn't make it to a transport themselves. Creed himself stayed until there was nothing left to stay for. The Lord Castellan, directing the last elements of the 8th Cadian Regiment in maintaining the final evacuation routes, was present on the surface of Cadia when the last transports cleared the atmosphere. What happened next is listed in the official records as missing in action, presumed dead. The unofficial accounts are more specific and involve a very tall figure in archaic armor whose geometric green light fell across the smoking ruins of a Casa gate, and a conversation that ended with Lord Castellan Creed agreeing to something in exchange for not dying on a planet that was actively being consumed by the warp. Trazin the Infinite has a very fine collection on his tomb world of Solemnace. It is catalogued and maintained with the obsessive care of someone who values objects and beings in proportion to their historical and strategic significance rather than their feelings about being collected. Lord Castellan Creed, the most strategically gifted mortal commander the Imperium produced in the final years of the 41st Millennium, was apparently deemed significant enough to preserve rather than lose. He is, according to the fragments of information that circulate in the rumor networks of the surviving Cadian diaspora in there, alive, in stasis, are preserved against whatever future emergency might make his particular combination of talent and stubbornness worth deploying again. The planet died over the hours following the evacuation. The Eye of Terror's expansion tore through the geological remnants of Cadia Tertius. The planet killer, to ensure nothing remained of the planet's organized defensive capability, swept what was left with its devastating primary weapon. Cadia tore itself apart, literally, tectonically, as the forces of the warp destabilized the gravitational and geological structures that had held a world together for billions of years. and what remained was an asteroid field. Chunks of rock and metal and the compressed architectural legacy of 10,000 years of fortress construction orbiting the star that had warmed Cadia's frozen tundras and axletree forests, as carrying in their composition the material remains of everything that the planet had been. The phrase that emerged from the survivors, that spread through the Cadian diaspora, and eventually through the wider Imperium. Cadia broke before the guard did. Not a boast, an acknowledgement. The planet was gone. The people who had been willing to die for it were not. They had held until there was no more holding to be done. That distinction mattered. That distinction was in the end what they had to offer. Section 10. The Great Rift tears open. A galaxy divided. The fall of Cadia was not itself the final catastrophe. It was the mechanism by which the final catastrophe was made possible. And the final catastrophe was something that happened over the course of days and weeks following Cadia's destruction, as the consequences propagated outward from that initial wound. The Eye of Terror, freed from the constraint of the pylon network, did not simply expand in the direction of the Cadian gate and stop. It expanded outward in multiple directions, reaching the natural extensions of warp instability that had been waiting for the lock to be removed. And as it expanded, it connected to things. Other warp storms, other rifts, other concentrations of psychic energy distributed across the galaxy that had their own internal momentum, and that, once connected to the Eye's expansion, found that they could feed it and be fed by it simultaneously. The Hadex anomaly, on the far side of the galaxy in the eastern fringe, lesser warp storms distributed across thousands of light years between. The accumulated psychic damage of 1,000 battlefields hit the spiritual echoes of genocides and planet killings and the mass death of entire civilizations. All of it connected, all of it feeding into a chain reaction of warp expansion that had no precedent in recorded history. The Great Rift tore open. The cicatrix maledictum, the cursed scar, spreading from the Eye of Terror across the galactic width to the Hadex anomaly, in a vast, writhing chain of interconnected warp storms and reality breaches that took days to fully stabilize into something approximating a consistent geographical feature. A wound across the face of the galaxy. A feature so large it could be seen from the surface of planets on both sides of it, visible as a tainted discoloration across the sky that the various cultures of the galaxy gave different names. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Crimson Path, plus the Mouth of Ruin, the Warp Scar, the Dethedian, Gork's Grin, the Devourer of Hope, and 1,000 others. What it meant in practical terms was that the Imperium of Man, 1 million worlds administered from Terra, under the authority of the High Lords and the God Emperor, was divided. Divided cleanly across the middle, with one half maintaining its connection to Terra and the Astronomicon, and the other half cut off. Not completely unreachably. There were passages through the rift, most notably the Nachmund Gauntlet near the Eye of Terror, treacherous but navigable, but effectively isolated. The Dark Imperium, the Imperium Nihilus, the half of humanity's domain that now existed beyond the rift, without reliable access to the psychic beacon that had guided ships through warp space for 10,000 years. Ere the Noctis Eterna, the Age of Darkness, followed immediately. The Astronomicon's light, dimmed by the strain placed on the Emperor and the disruption caused by the rift's formation, flickered. For a period measured in days and weeks, warp navigation across the Imperium became nearly impossible. Ships attempting transit were lost. Communication between systems failed. The machinery of imperial governance, which depended entirely on astropathic communication and warp travel for its basic function, ground toward paralysis in the absence of the infrastructure it had assumed was permanent. Worlds went dark. Not just the worlds in the Dark Imperium, though they went darkest. Worlds throughout the Imperium Sanctus as well, losing contact with their neighbors and with Terra. And suddenly, and terrifyingly alone, in the way that the galaxy of the mid-41st millennium had rarely been for any world that had a functional astropathic choir. The enemies of humanity, who had their own ways of operating that were less dependent on the Astronomicon, did not pause to allow the Imperium to recover. Chaos forces poured through the rift's breaches. Demonic incursions multiplied across both halves of the divided Imperium. The various Xenos threats that had been pressing from multiple directions simultaneously found that the Imperium's response capacity had been severely compromised at exactly the moment when they most needed it to be capable. In the Dark Imperium, things were worse in ways that are difficult to fully communicate. The Astronomicon was not just dim, it was absent, unblocked by the mass of roiling warp energy that constituted the Great Rift. Navigators, those mutant specialists whose third eye allowed them to perceive the warp and guide ships through it, lost their primary reference point. Some went mad. Some guided their ships into disasters that had no survivors. Many simply could not perform their function at all, leaving the fleets they were assigned to stranded at the last worlds they'd managed to reach before the rift formed. Whole sectors of the Dark Imperium effectively lost contact with each other, not just with Terra, each system fighting its own battles in what it was beginning to suspect might be permanent isolation. Abaddon had not reached Terra. That was the narrow tactical truth of what the 13th Black Crusade had accomplished. He had achieved his specific campaign objectives, but the ultimate strategic goal of completing what Horus had started, of reaching the Sol System and destroying the Emperor on his golden throne, remained unaccomplished. This was real. He had not won everything, but he had opened the Crimson Path. He had broken the lock. He had done, at the close of the 41st millennium, the one thing that 10,000 years of the Long War had been building toward, as the prerequisite for everything else. The Eye of Terror was no longer contained. The galaxy's wound was no longer held closed. Whatever came next in the Long War would be fought in a galaxy with a fundamentally different shape than the one that had contained the conflict for so long. For the Chaos Gods, this was sufficient. Not completion. Completion is not a concept that the Chaos Gods engage with in any meaningful way. But the shape of the galaxy at the close of the 41st millennium was, from the perspective of the ruinous powers, considerably more to their liking than it had been before Abaddon began his final crusade. Section 11. The Return of Something Old. Guilliman and the Indomitus Crusade. In the immediate aftermath of Cardia's fall, as the Great Rift stabilized into its new permanent configuration and the Noctis Aeterna gripped the galaxy, the Imperium needed something it had not required for 10,000 years. Someone who could look at the situation and respond to it with the kind of authority and capability that the crisis actually demanded. The High Lords of Terror had many qualities. They had, between them, administered the largest human civilization in history for 10,000 years. And they had navigated every kind of internal and external crisis that those 10,000 years had produced. They were, in their specific domains of expertise, extraordinarily capable. What they were not, had never been, and were never designed to be, was a unified military command capable of responding at the speed and scale that the current situation required. They were 17 competing power centers, each defending their institutional prerogatives while trying to coordinate the most complex emergency the Imperium had faced since the heresy. It was, by any objective measure, not sufficient. What was sufficient, as it turned out, was a man in a stasis field on the world of Macragge, who had been kept half alive for 10,000 years by a combination of Mechanicus intervention, Aeldari influence, and the will of someone so far above the ordinary human range of capability that describing his intentions as will is almost a courtesy. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, author of the Codex Astartes. The man who had, in the aftermath of the Horus heresy, organized the rebuilding of the Imperium's military structure from the ruins that the Civil War had left, establishing the frameworks and doctrines that had defined the Adeptus Astartes for 10,000 years. He had been struck down near the end of the heresy's aftermath by a poisoned blade wielded by the demon Fulgrim, and had been kept in stasis on the edge of death ever since, too valuable to let go, too injured to save with the technology available at the time. The technology required had been in development. Os Belisarius Cole had been assigned this project by Guilliman himself, before the Primarch went into stasis. A circular timeline that speaks to either extraordinary foresight or to someone operating with access to probability matrices that most minds can't process. Cole had been working on it for 3 centuries. The Harlequins had been engineering convergences that made the right people available in the right places. And in the immediate aftermath of Cadia's fall on Macragge, the processes that had been building toward this moment completed themselves. Guilliman woke. He woke to a galaxy divided by the Great Rift, to an Imperium that had calcified around the wound of his absence into something he had never intended to create, to enemies pressing from every direction, and to the knowledge that he had, approximately, no time. Yet he processed the situation with the speed that defined his capabilities across 10,000 years of legend and set about doing what needed to be done. He was named Lord Commander of the Imperium, the position that had existed in the organization he had designed as the supreme military authority, dormant for 10,000 years because no one had been judged capable of filling it without causing more problems than they solved. He began the Indomitus Crusade, the largest coordinated imperial military campaign since the Great Crusade itself. Fleets mobilized on a scale that had not been possible before, organized around a new element that Belisarius Cole had been quietly preparing for 3 centuries: the Primaris Space Marines. The Primaris were a new generation of enhanced warriors, built on a more sophisticated application of the Space Marine gene tech than the original, incorporating additional genetic sequences and biological modifications that the original chapters had never received. They were bigger, stronger, more resilient. Their armor was superior. Their weapons were more powerful, and they had been produced in secret, in numbers large enough to be militarily significant, available at exactly the moment when the Imperium most desperately needed military significant assets. Torchbearer fleets went out to every surviving Space Marine chapter, carrying reinforcements and the knowledge of how to continue producing them. The existing chapters were strengthened. New chapters were founded. The Adeptus Astartes as an institution was, for the first time in 10,000 years, genuinely expanding rather than holding steady against attrition. The Indomitus Crusade broke sieges. It liberated worlds. It pushed Chaos forces back from positions they had occupied since the Rift's formation. It was not a solution. The galaxy was still divided. The Rift still existed. The Dark Imperium was still cut off, and the enemies of humanity were still pressing on every front. But it was a response. A response with the scope and quality that the crisis required, led by someone whose capabilities were equal to the situation. Guilliman appointed Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, as regent of the Dark Imperium. Lord Commander Dante was over 1,000 years old, one of the most experienced commanders in the Adeptus Astartes, and the master of the chapter, whose homeworld of Baal had barely survived a Tyranid hive fleet's assault during the Noctis Eterna. He was not a comfortable choice, but he was a capable one, and the Dark Imperium needed someone whose authority was sufficient to coordinate its disparate surviving forces without requiring confirmation from a terror that couldn't reliably be contacted. The Nachmund Gauntlet, the treacherous passage near the Eye of Terror that remained as the primary route through the Great Rift, became the most strategically critical location in the galaxy. Control of it meant the ability to maintain at least some thread of connection between the Imperium Sanctus and the Imperium Nihilus. Lose it, and the two halves of the Imperium became effectively unable to reinforce each other at all. Vigilus, as the hive world on the far side of the gauntlet from Terra, became a vital staging ground and a symbol of why holding these passages mattered. It was the kind of place that, if lost, would signal the beginning of the end for the Dark Imperium's organized resistance. Abaddon had not failed to notice the strategic significance of the Nachmund Gauntlet. His Black Legion moved against Vigilus within the early years of the era Indomitus. That campaign is its own story, as brutal and complex as the 13th Black Crusade, and it demonstrated that whatever had happened to Abaddon's forces at Cadia, the losses, the destruction of the will of eternity, the personal wounds he had taken in the final fight, had not diminished the War Master's appetite for the Long War or his capability to prosecute it. The Long War continues. This is, yes, in the era of the 41st and 42nd millenniums, simply the fact of existence for every living being in the galaxy. The Great Rift persists. The Dark Imperium persists in its desperate isolation, its worlds fighting alone or in small coalitions, sustained by the faith that terror still exists on the other side of the storm. The Imperium Sanctus maintains its operations under Guilliman's increasingly strained authority, fighting multiple simultaneous wars while trying to rebuild institutional frameworks that have spent 10,000 years optimized for the wrong priorities. And on the far side of the rift, in the darkness that the forces of chaos have made their domain, Abaddon prepares whatever comes next in the implementation of a plan that has already proven it can take 10,000 years to execute and still arrive at its objective. Section 12, the weight of what was lost and what remains. There is a particular quality to the grief of losing something that was supposed to be permanent. Something that had been part of the background architecture of your world for so long that you stopped consciously registering it as present. The way you stop noticing the sound of a river near your house until the day it goes quiet, and the absence is louder than the sound ever was. Cadia was that for the Imperium. Not just a strategically vital fortress world, not just the anchor of the Cadian Gate's defenses, but a symbol that operated at the level of fundamental assumption. As long as Cadia stood, the worst outcomes remained theoretical. As long as Cadia stood, there was a place where the line existed. Its fall did not just remove a military asset, it removed a certainty. And the removal of certainties from the bedrock of a civilization's self-image does damage that takes generations to repair, if it is ever repaired at all. The Cadian survivors scattered across the galaxy are carrying something that is harder to quantify than military capability or cultural tradition, though they carry those things too. They are carrying the memory of how it actually ended, not with a rout, not with surrender, not with the defenders breaking and running when the situation became clearly lost. With the planet itself breaking and the people still standing on it. That distinction matters more than any propaganda office could make it, because it is true. The Cadians who came off that world, who arrived on the worlds of the Cadian Gate and beyond, carrying their regimental standards and their tactical doctrine and the unbroken chain of who they were, had not been defeated in any sense that they recognized as defeat. They had been bereaved. Cadia broke before the Guard did. This is not a boast. It is an accurate statement about what happened in a specific order. The planet broke. The Guard did not. When the Guard finally left, when there was genuinely nothing left to defend, they left as a fighting force, in order, holding corridors so that other people could evacuate, performing the rearguard function with the same professionalism they had brought to every other function of the campaign. They were, in the end, Cadians. And Cadians do not stop being what they are because the place that made them no longer exists. As the strategic implications of Cadia's fall continue to reverberate in ways that military analysts are still documenting and debating, the Cadian Gate as a defensive concept still exists. There are still Imperial forces defending the approaches to the Eye of Terror, still fortress worlds in the system and the surrounding regions, still the same fundamental geography that made Cadia important. Agrippina still holds. Other worlds in the system fight on. The Astartes Praeses still rotate through the region. But these forces are now fighting a fundamentally different defensive problem than they were before. The lock is gone, and the cage door is open. And maintaining a defensive perimeter around an open door is a qualitatively different challenge than maintaining one around a closed and locked door. It requires more, offers less certainty, and produces a very different psychological experience for the people doing the defending. Belisarius' call continues working. The understanding of Noctilith and its relationship to warp energy that he developed while activating the Cadian pylon network was a genuine scientific breakthrough, the kind that changes what is considered possible for the civilization that achieves it. The Adeptus Mechanicus now understands, in principle, how to suppress warp incursions using Blackstone in ways they did not understand before. The practical application of this knowledge, finding sufficient Blackstone, processing it correctly, deploying it at useful scales, is a problem that will occupy Call and his colleagues for decades at minimum. But the understanding exists. The possibility exists. There is in the rubble of Cadia's catastrophe as a seed of something that could eventually be used to begin closing the wound. The Necrons are themselves working on similar problems, from their own perspective and toward their own ends. The Silent King Sarek has awakened fully and is directing the construction of a new pylon network on a galaxy-spanning scale, the Pariah Nexus, a project whose scope makes the original Cadian network look like a prototype. The implications of this for everyone else in the galaxy are complex and contested and deeply uncertain, because the Necron's definition of a solved galaxy does not necessarily overlap with anyone else's. Guilliman, working from Ultramar and from Terra, it continues the enormous project of reforming institutions that have been calcifying toward dysfunction for 10,000 years, while simultaneously fighting the most complex military situation the Imperium has faced since the Horus Heresy. He is, by the accounts of those who have worked with him in the current era, simultaneously the most capable individual in the Imperium and the most frustrated one, a man who can see very clearly what needs to be done and who is discovering, at intimate practical range, why it hasn't been done already. The resistance of entrenched institutional interest to the kind of change he recognizes as necessary is one of the most significant battles he fights, and it produces far fewer medals than the battles with chaos. Abaddon has taken the title of War Master finally, after 10,000 years of refusing it, yet he took it after Cadia. He took it because the title's association with Horus's failure no longer troubled him. He had succeeded where Horus had failed, had accomplished the objective that had defined the long war since the Horus heresy ended, had earned the right to the title through achievement rather than inheritance. He is now, by his own assessment and by the assessment of his enemies, genuinely the War Master of Chaos undivided. And he is not finished. He has never been finished. Finishing is not a concept that applies to someone who has been waging the same war for 10,000 years and considers it ongoing. The psychic awakening that followed the Great Rift's formation has changed something fundamental about the galaxy's psychic environment in ways that are still working themselves out. More humans are manifesting psychic abilities. The abilities of existing psykers are often stronger and less controllable. Phenomena that used to be rare are becoming common. The barrier between real space and the immaterium is thinner than it has ever been, and that thinness expresses itself in ways that can be beneficial. Some psykers are developing abilities of unusual power and clarity, and in ways that are catastrophic. Demonic manifestations are more frequent, more powerful, and more sustained than they were in the earlier decades of the 41st millennium. The galaxy of the era Indomitus is not the galaxy of a century before. It is louder, more dangerous, more saturated with the energies of the warp, more openly contested between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. The certainties that sustained the Imperium through the long stasis of the 41st millennium, the certainty that the Cadian Gate would hold, the certainty that the Eye of Terror was contained, the certainty that the basic geography of the conflict was stable, are gone. In their place is something more honest about the nature of the long war. It is a war that can be lost, and it is closer to being lost than it has been since the Siege of Terra. But it has not been lost. The Imperium persists. It persists with the specific kind of stubborn bloody-mindedness that the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated was genuinely present in its people when tested at the absolute limit of what could be asked of them. 3 million Cadians made it off a dying world. The guard did not break. As the Space Marines who went into the Will of Eternity, knowing they almost certainly weren't coming back out, made the shot that destroyed the Will of Eternity possible. Celestine descended when she was needed. Call finished what he had started. Creed held the line until there was no line left. These are not small things. These are the things that civilizations are made of in the final accounting. The story of the 13th Black Crusade is a tragedy in the strict sense, a narrative in which characters of real worth are undone by forces of real power, and the ending is genuinely bad. Cardia is gone. The galaxy is broken. The Imperium is weaker. These are true things. But tragedy is not the same as defeat. And the people who came out of the 13th Black Crusade, the scattered Cadians, the battered Space Marine chapters, and the survivors and the refugees and the wounded and the unwilling witnesses to the worst thing the Eye of Terror had yet produced. They came out of it as themselves, changed, scarred, diminished in some ways, but themselves. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also, somehow, always the choice of how to fight it. That is what Cadia left behind when the planet broke. Not a location, not a strategic asset, not a gate or a fortress or a geographical feature on a map. A question answered, and the answer was, you hold the line until the line is gone, and when the line is gone, you find the next line, and you hold that one too, until there is nothing left to hold, and maybe, even after that. Closing. For those who made it here. If you stayed with this all the way through, and I want you to sit with that for a moment before the credits roll in your head, because the 13th Black Crusade is one of those events in Warhammer 40,000 lore that actually rewards the full treatment. The version where you just talk about Cadia falling and Abaddon winning is fine as far as it goes. But this version, the one where you understand the 10,000 years of patient preparation, the one where you feel the weight of what Cadia meant before it was gone, the one where Creed and Celestine and Bloodhowl and Trazyn and Call are real people making real choices in a situation that was genuinely impossible. This version is why we spend so much time in this universe. This is the story that changed everything in 40K. The timeline that had been almost frozen for the game's entire history finally moved. The world of Cadia, which had existed in the lore as an eternal present-tense fortress world for decades of real time, finally fell. And what it fell into was the current era, the age of the Dark Imperium, the Psychic Awakening, the Indomitus Crusade, all of it rooted in that moment when the pylons failed and the galaxy cracked. If this hit differently than the way you'd heard it before, or if it filled in gaps you hadn't even known were there, hit like and let me know in the comments. I want to know what part of this landed hardest for you. Was it Creed? Abaddon's 10,000-year plan? The pylons and what they were actually doing? Tell me what's stuck. There is so much more to explore from here. The Plague Wars, where Gilliman has to defend Ultramar from Mortarian's Death Guard, the siege of the Fenris system, the War of Beasts on Vigilus, and the full story of the Psychic Awakening, the Indomitus Crusade's journey across the galaxy. We have months of this, and I am genuinely looking forward to every one of them. Subscribe if you haven't. It costs nothing, and it means these stories reach more people, which is the whole point. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Until next time, the Emperor protects, and Cadia stands. Q. On 40,000, the stories worth telling, told the way they deserve. Appendix. The key figures who shaped the Crusade. Portraits in the dark. Because no story this large lives in its events alone. It lives in the people who moved through those events. Let's spend a little more time with the figures whose choices made the difference. The ones whose names keep appearing in the accounts and deserve more than a passing mention. Usaka E. Shag Creed, the man the Cadians needed. You could make the argument that Cadia survived as long as it did specifically because of one person. Creed was not a superhuman. He was not a space marine, not a psyker, not blessed by any divine power, not carrying any weapon that could threaten the material form of a god. He was a mortal officer in his middle years, with a smoking habit, a blunt manner, and a brain that processed military information the way a savant processes mathematics, faster than the surrounding process, with less visible effort, and with results that appeared almost magical to observers who couldn't see the calculation underneath. What made Creed genuinely exceptional, beyond the tactical instinct that was documented in every account of his career, was his understanding of what soldiers needed to keep functioning under pressure that exceeded their training parameters. The gap between what the Cadian defenders on the Casacraft ramparts had been trained to face and what they were actually facing during the 13th Black Crusade was substantial. Chaos forces, demonic manifestations, the constant psychic pressure of proximity to the eye of terror at its worst, the knowledge that the command structure had been decapitated and the relief forces might not arrive. These were not individually unprecedented, but in combination and at the sustained intensity of the 13th Black Crusade's peak phases, they were a pressure that training only partially prepared soldiers for. As Creed prepared them for it with something that training can't fully replicate, his presence. He was on the ramparts when the ramparts were being contested. He was in the hospital bays when the wounded were being brought in, not delivering speeches, but checking on people by name when he knew them, asking specific questions about their units when he didn't. He ate with the troops. He slept in the same conditions they did, which, given the state of Casacraft's facilities during the siege, meant sleeping in conditions that would have made most senior commanders request reassignment. He did it because he understood that soldiers who can see their commander sharing their experience are soldiers who will not leave their posts when the rational calculation says leaving is the right call. He was not a saint, and the novelization of the fall of Cadia presents him as a more complicated figure than the legend that would be built around him. A man who made tactical errors that cost lives, who drank too much when drinking was available, who could be brutal in his assessments of subordinates who failed him. The aura of invincibility that the Cadian people attached to him was, as auras always are, a simplification of a more complicated truth. But even the complicated truth was remarkable. A more complicated remarkable than the legend, and in many ways more useful for understanding how the defense actually worked. His relationship with Jaron Kell, his color sergeant, and perhaps his only genuine friend, is the human thread running through the entire campaign narrative. Kell carried the standard of the Cadian 8th throughout the siege, the tattered colors planted again and again in positions that were being contested and should not have been held. And the act of planting that standard was itself a tactical tool, because Cadian soldiers who saw it knew where Creed was, and soldiers who knew where Creed was tended to gravitate toward holding whatever ground he was on. It was a feedback loop of morale and tactical positioning that the enemy's own commanders noted as unusually effective. Saint Celestine, faith made incarnate. She has died before, multiple times by accounts that span several campaigns across the 41st millennium. Each time, she has returned. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, believe without reservation that Celestine is the Emperor's instrument, a being elevated from mortal humanity through the purity and completeness of her faith. She is sustained in existence not by biology or even psychic power in the conventional sense, but by the will of the God Emperor acting through her. The Inquisition has investigated this belief and periodically concluded that the evidence does not definitively rule it out, which for the Inquisition constitutes something approaching endorsement. What Celestine is, theologically speaking, is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate that the scholars conducting it tend to conduct very carefully. What she is, functionally, on a battlefield, is someone whose presence changes the psychology of everyone around her, not through fear or authority, through something that the people who experienced it consistently described as recognition, the sense that she was what they were supposed to be fighting for, made visible and present in a place where everything the Imperium valued was being tested at its absolute limit. Her resurrection of Eleanor and Genevieve during the battle was not just militarily significant, though it was militarily significant. It was symbolically enormous. In a campaign that had been about the erosion of certainties, the betrayal by the Volscani cataphracts, the assassination of the High Command, the will of eternity, demonstrating what was possible when you pointed something that size at a planet, Celestine's return from a battle she hadn't even been in, bringing back warriors who had been killed in her absence, was the kind of thing that doesn't fit into normal tactical analysis. It was an assertion that the standard rules of what was possible did not fully apply here, and that assertion, yet in the specific psychological context of that defense, was worth regiments. Sven Bloodhowl, the wolf who set the trap. Sven Bloodhowl led the boarding assault on the will of eternity, knowing the mathematics of what he was proposing. 200 space marines against a structure that housed thousands of chaos warriors, commanded by Abaddon, the despoiler himself, with no reliable extraction plan. The expectation going in was not survival. The expectation was the completion of one specific objective, the shield system sabotage, that would create a window for the phalanx to fire. The Space Wolves have a specific cultural relationship with that kind of calculation. Their traditions valorize the warrior who spends themselves completely in service of the pack, who makes the trade that the pack needs made, knowing what it costs. Bloodhowl's boarding action was that trade at the maximum possible scale. He took the fight to the Warmaster of Chaos in person, inside the Warmaster's own command fortress, and what he accomplished was not his own survival, but the condition that allowed Cardia to survive the will of eternity. He did not survive the encounter with Abaddon. His wounds were described as mortal. Whether the Wolf Lord ultimately recovered in the aftermath of the campaign is not definitively resolved in the records available, which is itself a kind of answer. The accounts of his fate are obscure enough that something unusual happened to him, one way or another. Trazyn the Infinite, the strangest ally. Trazyn's involvement in the 13th Black Crusade remains one of the most tonally dissonant elements of the whole story, which is saying something for a campaign that also involved a living saint resurrecting dead warriors and an archmagos cracking the secrets of alien mega-engineering under fire. The Necron Overlord, who showed up to help defend a human fortress world because the battle was damaging his collection, it is, in its own way, one of the most characteristically 40K details possible. The grimdark universe, where even your unexpected allies have motivations that are deeply alien to any conventional concept of heroism. But Trazyn's contribution was real and substantial. His knowledge of Noctilith was direct and experiential. He had been present when pylon networks like Cadia's were built, had watched the original Necron engineers work out the operational principles of Blackstone manipulation. Man retained in his ancient but eccentric memory the specific technical understanding that Call needed and couldn't independently derive. Without him, the pylon activation might not have happened in time, if it happened at all. The Eye of Terror might not have begun contracting. The final confrontation might have unfolded without that particular weapon in the Imperial arsenal. His acquisition of Creed at the end of the campaign is simultaneously the funniest and the most sinister thing he did. He didn't save Creed out of any recognizable version of altruism. He saved Creed because Creed was historically significant and potentially useful, and because the specific kind of person who views the galaxy's inhabitants primarily as objects of collection would naturally preserve the most effective military commander of the most significant battle of the current era, rather than simply let him die on a planet that was being consumed by the warp. Trazyn's collection contains, by his own account, extraordinary things. The only reliable witness to exactly what is in it is Trazyn himself, and Trazyn lies with the casual ease of someone who has had millions of years to practice. Chutz, Belisarius Call, the man who understood the puzzle. Call is a figure who bridges the events of the Horus Heresy and the current era in a way that very few living beings can claim, not through the longevity of an undying machine being like the Necrons, but through a combination of radical life extension technologies, extensive augmentation, and the specific kind of mechanicus willingness to sacrifice biological normalcy in pursuit of accumulated knowledge that makes Senior Magi some of the strangest humans in existence. He had been working on the pylon problem for a long time before the 13th Black Crusade. Not as his primary focus. His primary focus was the Primaris project, on the development of the new generation of Space Marines that Guilliman had commissioned centuries before going into stasis, and which would become the most significant military development of the era in Demetus. But the pylon question was always there, a side channel of research that accumulated slowly as Call's understanding of Noctilith deepened. When the Harlequins directed him to the specific planet that gave him the final piece of his model, when the theoretical framework clicked into complete form, and he understood what the pylons could actually do, he moved to Cadia with the urgency that the understanding demanded. The collaboration with Trazyn was, by all accounts, one of the more unusual scientific partnerships in human history. Two beings from radically different civilizations, or one effectively immortal and ancient beyond comprehension, one mortal by comparison, but old enough to have lost track of exactly how old, working together on the most urgent deadline either of them had faced in a very long time, using complementary knowledge to crack a problem that neither could have solved alone. Whether they got along during the process is not recorded. It probably did not matter, given the circumstances. What Call achieved in those tunnels under Cadia, the activation of the full pylon network, the demonstrated proof that the Eye of Terror could be pushed back, is, in the scientific reckoning of the Adeptus Mechanicus, one of the most significant achievements of the current millennium. It ultimately failed to save Cadia, but it proved that the failure was not inevitable, that if Abaddon had not had the debris of the Will of Eternity available as a weapon of last resort, the campaign might have ended differently, that the tools existed to close the Eye of Terror, if sufficient Blackstone could be found and correctly deployed. The search for Noctilith is, in the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, one of the defining strategic competitions of the current era. Both the Adeptus Mechanicus and the resurgent Necrons understand its significance. The galaxy's remaining deposits of Blackstone are scattered and contested and insufficient for the scale of pylon network that would be needed to do to the Great Rift what the Cadian pylons were doing to the Eye of Terror. But insufficient is not the same as impossible, and in the grim darkness of the far future, insufficient but not impossible is often the most optimistic description of any situation. The Cadian people, 10,000 years of being ready. There is a tendency in these kinds of narratives to reduce the defenders of Cadia to a backdrop for the more famous individual figures, Creed and Celestine and the Space Marines, and the special characters whose names appear in the Codex entries. This would be wrong, and it would miss the most important thing about why the defense lasted as long as it did. Cadia was not defended primarily by exceptional individuals. It was defended by 10,000 years of cultural investment in the specific capabilities required to defend it. The ordinary Cadian soldier, the shock trooper in the line, the tanker keeping a Lehman Russ operational under fire, the artilleryman calculating trajectories for macro cannon batteries during an orbital assault, was the product of a civilization that had organized itself entirely around the specific challenge of standing between the Eye of Terror and everything else. This did not make them immune to fear or despair. It did not make them incapable of error or panic. It made them, in aggregate, the most comprehensively prepared baseline human soldiers in the galaxy for the precise situation they were facing. The Kaskin, the Cadian Special Operations Forces Creed, dispatched into the Eye on reconnaissance missions at the very start of the campaign, were the exemplars of this. Soldiers willing to go into the Eye of Terror on intelligence missions, knowing the probability of return was low, yet because someone needed to go, and they were the ones most capable of making the attempt useful. The ones who made it to Earthward and died there watching the planet killer arrive. They accomplished what they were sent to do. The intelligence they gathered, transmitted before the end, informed Creed's preparation. Their deaths were not waste. In the Cadian calculus, that distinction mattered enormously. What the Cadians who survived carried with them into the diaspora was not just a culture. It was a proof of concept, a demonstrated answer to the question of what organized, sustained, generationally invested human determination could accomplish against the worst that chaos could bring. The answer was enough to matter, not enough to win, ultimately, when Abaddon came with 10,000 years of preparation behind him, but enough to make the victory cost him more than he anticipated, enough to destroy the Will of Eternity, enough to have the pylons briefly close the Eye. Enough for the legacy of how it ended to be worth something to the people who came after. Cadia's children are everywhere now, spread across 100 worlds, drilling and training and maintaining the traditions that were refined by 10,000 years of fortress life. They are not replaceable. The specific culture that Cadia produced requires the specific conditions of Cadia to produce it, and those conditions are gone. But what they preserved, what they brought out with them, is not nothing. The 8th Cadian Regiment still exists. Other regiments still exist. New generations will be raised in the traditions of worlds that received the Cadian diaspora, are shaped differently than Cadia, but shaped partially by what Cadia was. Cadia stands. The planet does not, the people do, and that, in the long accounting of the 41st Millennium, is the most Cadian possible ending to a Cadian story. A final thought. Why this story matters now. If you have been playing Warhammer 40,000 since before 2017, before the Gathering Stormbooks landed and changed everything, then you remember what it was like to play in a setting where the end of the 41st Millennium was always exactly a minute away and never actually arrived. The 13th Black Crusade was perpetually imminent. Cadia was perpetually under threat. The Eye of Terror was perpetually pressing against the gate. And the clock was always at 1 minute to midnight, every year, edition after edition, with the hands never quite moving. While this had its own kind of narrative comfort, the setting was stable, the conflicts were eternal, nothing would change enough to invalidate your collection or make the background lore you had learned obsolete. Abaddon's apparently unbroken record of crusades that ended in pushback rather than breakthrough became one of the things the community joked about, a long-running bit that generated its own cultural tradition within the hobby. And then Games Workshop decided to actually move the clock, to let midnight arrive, to find out what was on the other side of the moment that the setting had been treating as the permanent edge of the world. What was on the other side was the current era, the setting as it exists right now, in all its new catastrophic complexity. Guilliman awake and working the problem, the great rift dividing the galaxy. The Dark Imperium fighting alone, the Primaris Space Marines, the Psychic Awakening, the Plague Wars. A version of 40,000 that actually has a current events section, where lore from 6 months ago might be superseded by what comes out this season. The 13th Black Crusade is the hinge point. Everything before it was one kind of story. Everything after it is another. The fall of Cadia is the moment when the setting stopped being in eternal stasis and became, for the first time in its history, a story with a present tense. For those of us who fell in love with 40K in the old era, there is something genuinely poignant about that transition. The setting we knew changed in ways that are real and irreversible. Cadia is gone. The 41st Millennium ended. Whatever is happening now is something new, but what replaced it is also extraordinary. The stories available in the current era, the scale of what is at stake, the moral complexity of the choices being made by the characters we follow, the genuine uncertainty about how the Long War ultimately resolves. These are stories worth telling with exactly the kind of care and weight that the material deserves. That is what we do here on this channel. We tell these stories the way they deserve to be told, slowly, with the full weight of their history, with attention to the people inside the events, rather than just the events themselves. With the understanding that the reason this fiction matters is not the statistics or the game mechanics, but the stories it tells about what it means to hold a line when the line is impossible to hold. To find something worth fighting for, in a universe that offers very little reason to believe in anything, to be human in the darkest of all dark futures. Thank you for being here for this one. Truly. This story took everything I had, and knowing that there are people who want to hear it told this way makes every bit of that worthwhile. Until next time, Cadia stands.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.